The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. Read by Bob Newfeld. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Introduction. On February the 1st, 1887, the Lady Vane was lost by collision with a derelict when about the latitude 10 degrees south and longitude 107 degrees west. On January the 5th, 1888, that is 11 months and 4 days after my uncle, Edward Prendick, a private gentleman who certainly went aboard the Lady Vane at Callao and who had been considered drowned, was picked up in latitude 50 degrees 3 minutes south and longitude 101 degrees west in a small open boat of which the name was illegible, but which is supposed to have belonged to the missing schooner Ipecacuana. He gave such a strange account of himself that he was supposed demented. Subsequently, he alleged that his mind was a blank from the moment of his escape from the Lady Vane. His case was discussed among psychologists at the time as a curious instance of the lapse of memory consequent upon physical and mental stress. The following narrative was found among his papers by the undersigned, his nephew and heir, but unaccompanied by any definite bequest for publication. The only island known to exist in the region in which my uncle was picked up is Noble's Isle, a small volcanic islet and uninhabited. It was visited in 1891 by HMS Scorpion. A party of sailors then landed, but found nothing living thereon except certain curious white moths, some hogs and rabbits, and some rather peculiar rats. So that this narrative is without confirmation in its most essential particular. If not understood, there seems no harm in putting this strange story before the public in accordance, as I believe, with my uncle's intentions. There is at least this much to his behalf. My uncle passed out of human knowledge about latitude 50 degrees south and longitude 105 degrees east, and reappeared in the same part of the ocean after a space of 11 months. In some way he must have lived during the interval, and it seems that a schooner called the Ipecacuana with a drunken captain, John Davies, did start from Africa with a crew of 7 other animals aboard in January 1887. But the vessel was well known at several ports in the South Pacific, and when it finally disappeared from those seas with a considerable amount of coke on board, sailing to its unknown fate from London in December 1887. A date that tallies entirely with my uncle's story. Charles Edward Prendick. The story written by Edward Prendick. Chapter 1. In the Dinghy of the Lady Vane. I do not propose to add anything to what has already been written concerning the loss of the Lady Vane. As everyone knows, she collided with a derelict when 10 days out from Callao. The longboat, the 7 of the crew, was picked up 18 days after by 8-ton gunboat Michael, and the story of their terrible privations has become quite as well known as the far more horrible reducing case. But I have to add to the published story of the Lady Vane another, possibly as horrible and far stranger. It has hitherto been supposed that the 4 men who were in the dinghy perished, but this is incorrect. I have the best of evidence for this assertion. I was one of the 4 men. But in the first place, I must state that there never were 4 men in the dinghy. The number was 3. Constance, who was seen by the captain, jumped into the gig. Luckily for us, and unluckily for himself, did not reach us. He came down out of the tangle of ropes, under the stays of a smashed bowsprit. Some small rope caught his heel as he let go, and he hung for a moment head downward, and then fell and struck a block or spar floating in the water. We pulled towards him, but he never came up. I may say luckily for us he did not reach us, and I may also say luckily for himself. for we had only a small beaker of water and some solid ship's biscuits with us. So sudden had been the alarm, so unprepared the ship for any disaster. We thought the people on the launch would be better provisioned, though it seems they were not, and we tried to hail them. They could not have heard us, and the next morning, when the drizzle cleared, which was not until past midday, we could see nothing of them. We could not stand up and look about us because of the pitching of the boat. The two other men who had escaped so far with me were a man named Helmar, a passenger like myself, and a seaman whose name I don't know, a short, sturdy man with a stammer. We drifted famishing, and after our water had come to an end, tormented by an intolerable thirst for 8 days altogether. After the second day, the sea subsided slowly to a glassy calm. It is quite impossible for the ordinary reader to imagine those 8 days. He has not, luckily for himself, anything in his memory to imagine with. After the first day, we said little to one another, but lay in our places in the boat and stared at the horizon, or watched, with eyes that grew larger and more haggard every day, the misery and weakness gaining upon our companions. The sun became pitiless. The water ended on the 4th day, and we were already thinking strange things and saying them with our eyes. But it was, I think, the 6th before Helmar gave voice to the thing we had all been thinking. I remember our voices were dry and thin, so that we bent towards one another and spared our words. I stood out against it with all my might, was rather for scuttling the boats and perishing together among the sharks that followed us. But when Helmar said that if his proposal was accepted, we should have drink, the sailor came round to him. I would not draw lots, however, and in the night the sailor whispered to Helmar again and again, and I sat in the bows with my clasped knife in my hand, though I doubt if I had the stuff in me to fight. And in the morning I agreed to Helmar's proposal, and we handed halfpence to find the odd man. The lot fell upon the sailor, but he was the strongest of us and would not abide by it, and attacked Helmar with his hands. They grappled together and almost stood up. I crawled along the boat to them, intending to help Helmar by grasping the sailor's leg. But the sailor stumbled with the swaying of the boat, and the two fell upon the gunwale and rode overboard together. They sank like stones. I remember laughing at that, and wondering why I laughed. The laugh caught me suddenly, like a thing from without. I lay across one of the thwarts for I know not how long, thinking that if I had the strength, I would drink seawater and madden myself to die quickly. And even as I lay there, I saw, with no more interest than if it had been a picture, a sail come up towards me over the skyline. My mind must have been wandering, and yet I remember all that happened quite distinctly. I remember how my head swayed with
Begin by simply listening. Slow down and see just how peaceful today can be. Thank you so much for being here. This is gonna be, if this goes right, Dracula Chapter 27 and Mega Man 3. I'm really excited. So good of you to be.
The Island of Dr. Moreau. by H.G. As I lay there, I saw, with no more interest than if it had been a picture, a sail come up towards me over the skyline. My mind must have been wandering, and yet I remember all that happened quite distinctly. I remember how my head swayed with the seas, and the horizon with the sail above it danced up and down. But I also remember as distinctly that I had a persuasion that I was dead, and that I thought what a jest it was that they should come too late by such a little to catch me with my body. For an endless period, as it seemed to me, I lay with my head on the thwart watching the schooner. She was a little ship, schooner rigged fore and aft, come up out of the sea. She kept tacking to and fro in a winding compass, for she was sailing dead into the wind. It never entered my head to attempt to attract attention, but I do not remember anything distinctly after the sight of her side, until I found myself in a little cabin aft. There's a dim half-memory of being lifted up to the gangway, and of a big round countenance, covered with freckles and surrounded with red hair, staring at me over the bulwarks. I also had a discontented impression of a dark face, with extraordinary eyes close to mine. But that, I thought, was a nightmare, until I met him again. I fancy I recollect some stuff being poured in between my teeth. And that was all. Chapter 2. The Man Who Was Going Nowhere. The cabin in which I found myself was small and rather untidy. A youngish man with flaxen hair, a bristly straw-colored mustache, and a dropping nether lip was sitting and holding my wrist. For a minute we stared at each other without speaking. He had watery gray eyes, oddly void of expression. Then, just overhead, came a sound like an iron bedstead being knocked about, and the low, angry growling of some large animal. At the same time, the man spoke. He repeated his question. "How do you feel now?" "I think," I said, "I felt all right." I could not recollect how I had got there. He must have seen the question in my face, for my voice was inaccessible to me. "You were picked up in a boat, starving. The name on the boat was the Lady Vane, and there were spots of blood on the gunwale." At the same time, my eye caught my hand, so thin that it looked like a dirty skin purse full of loose bones, and all the business of the boat came back to me. "Have some of this," said he, and gave me a dose of some scarlet stuff, iced. It tasted like blood, and made me feel stronger. "You were in luck," said he, "to get picked up by a ship with a medical man aboard." He spoke with a slobbering articulation, with the ghost of a lisp. "What ship is this?" I said slowly, hoarse from my long silence. "It's a little trader from Africa in Callao. I never asked where she came from in the beginning. Out of the land of born fools, I guess. I'm a passenger myself, from Africa. The silly ass who owns her, his captain too, named Davies. He's lost his certificate or something. You know the kind of man. Calls the thing the Ipecacuana, of all silly infernal names. Though when there's much of a sea without any wind, she certainly acts accordingly." Then the noise overhead began again, a snarling growl and the voice of a human being together, telling some heaven-forsaken idiot to desist. "You were nearly dead," said my interlocutor. "It is a very near thing indeed. But I put some stuff into you now. Notice your arms sore? Injections. You've been insensible for nearly 30 hours. I thought slowly. I was distracted now by the yelping of a number of dogs. Am I eligible for solid food? I asked. Thanks to me, he said. Even now the mutton is boiling. Yes, I said with assurance. I could eat some mutton. But, said he with a momentary hesitation, you know, I'm dying to hear of how you he suddenly left the cabin, and I heard him in violent controversy with someone who seemed to me to talk gibberish in response to him. The matter sounded as if it ended in blows, but in that I thought my ears were mistaken. Then he shouted at the dogs and returned to the cabin. "Well," said he in a doorway, "you were just beginning to tell me." I told him my name, Edward Friendly, and how I had taken to natural history as a relief from the dullness of my comfortable independence. He seemed interested in this. "I've done some science myself. I did my biology at University College, getting out the ovary of the earthworm and the regular of the snail and all that. Lord, it's 10 years ago. But go on. Tell me about the boat." He was evidently satisfied with the frankness of my story, which I told in concise sentences enough, for I felt horribly weak. And when it was finished, he reverted at once to the topic of natural history and his own biological studies. He began to question me closely about Tottenham Court Road and Gower Street. Is Capazzi still flourishing? What a shot that was! He had evidently been a very ordinary medical student and drifted incontinently to the topic of the music halls. He told me some anecdotes. "Left it all," he said, 10 years ago. How jolly it all used to be. But I made a young ass of myself, played myself out before I was 21. I dare say it's all different now. But I must look up that ass of a cook and see what he's done to go mutton. The growling overhead was renewed, so suddenly, and with so much savage anger, that it startled me. "What's that?" I called after him, but the door had closed. He came back again with the boiled mutton, and I was so excited by the appetizing smell of it that I forgot the noise of the beast that had troubled me. After a day of alternate sleep and feeding, I was so far recovered as to be able to get from my bunk to the study and see the green seas trying to keep pace with us. I judged the schooner was running before the wind. Montgomery, that was the name of the flaxen-haired man, came in again as I stood there, and I asked him for some clothes. He lent me some duck things of his own, for those I had worn in the boat had been thrown overboard. They were rather loose for me, for he was large, long in his limbs. He told me casually that the captain was 3 parts drunk in his own cabin. As I assumed the clothes, I began asking him some questions about the destination of the ship. He said the ship was bound to Hawaii, but that it had to land him first. "Where?" said I. "It's an island where I live. So far as I know, it hasn't got a name." He stared at me with his nether lip dropping and looked so willfully stupid in the sun that it came into my head that he desired to avert my question. I had the discretion to ask no more. Chapter 3. A Strange Face. We left the cabin and found my other companion obstructing our way. He was standing on the ladder with his back to us, peering over the coping of a hatchway. He was, I could see, a misshapen man, short, broad, and clumsy, with a crooked back, a hairy neck, and a head sunk between his shoulders. He was dressed in dark blue serge, and had peculiarly thick, coarse black hair. I heard the unseen dogs growl furiously, and forthwith he ducked back, coming into contact with the hand I put out to fend him off from myself. He turned with animal swiftness. In some indefinable way, the black face thus flashed upon me shocked me profoundly. It was a singularly deformed one. The facial part projected, forming something dimly suggestive of a muzzle, and the huge half-open mouth showed as big white teeth as I had ever seen in a human mouth. His eyes were bloodshot at the edges, with scarcely a rim of white round the hazel pupils. There was a curious glow of excitement in his face. "Confound you," said Montgomery. "Why the devil don't you get out of the way?" The black-faced man started aside without a word. I went on up the companion, staring at him instinctively as I did so. Montgomery stayed at the foot for a moment. "You have no business here, you know," he said in a deliberate tone. "Your place is forward." The black-faced man cowered. "They won't have me forward." He spoke slowly, with a queer, hoarse quality in his voice. "Won't have you forward," said Montgomery in a menacing voice, "but I tell you to go." He was on the brink of saying something further, then looked up at me suddenly and followed me up the ladder. I had paused halfway through the hatchway, looking back, still astonished beyond measure at the grotesque ugliness of the black-faced creature. I had never beheld such a repulsive and extraordinary face before. And yet, if the contradiction is credible, I experienced at the same time an odd feeling that in some way I had already encountered exactly the features and gestures that now amazed me. Afterwards, it occurred to me that probably I had seen him as I was lifted aboard, and yet that scarcely satisfied my suspicion of a previous acquaintance. Yet how one could have set eyes on so singular a face and yet have forgotten the precise occasion passed my imagination. Montgomery's movements to follow me released my attention, and I turned and looked about me at the flush deck of the little schooner. I was already half prepared by the sounds I had heard for what I saw. Certainly, I never beheld a deck so dirty. It was littered with scraps of carrot, shreds of green stuff, and indescribable filth. Fastened by chains to the main mast were a number of grisly staghounds who now began leaping and barking at me. And by the mizzen, a huge puma was crammed in a little iron cage far too small even to give it turning room. Farther under the starboard bulwark were some big hutches containing a number of ladders, and a solitary dog was squeezed in a mere box of a cage forward. The dogs were muzzled by leather straps. The only human being on deck was a gaunt and silent sailor at the wheel. The patch and dirty spangles were tense before the wind, and up aloft, the little ship seemed carrying every sail she had. The sky was clear, the sun midway down the western sky. Long waves, capped by the breeze with froth, were running with us. We went past the steersman to the taffrail, so the water come floating under the stern, and the bubbles go dancing and vanishing in the wake. I turned and surveyed the unsavory length of the ship. "Is this an ocean menagerie?" said I. "Looks like it," said Montgomery. "What are these beasts for? Merchandise? Curios? Does the captain think he is going to sell them somewhere in the South Seas?" "It looks like it, doesn't it?" said Montgomery, and turned towards the deck again. Suddenly, we heard a yelp and a volley of furious blasphemy from the companion hatchway, and the deformed man with the black face came up hurriedly. He was immediately followed by a heavy red-haired man in a white cap. At the sight of the former, the staghounds, who were all tired of barking at me by this time, became furiously excited, howling and leaping against their chains. The black hesitated before them, and this gave the red-haired man time to come up with him and deliver a tremendous blow between his shoulder blades. The poor devil went down like a felled ox and rolled in the dirt among the furiously excited dogs. It was lucky for him that they were muzzled. The red-haired man gave a yelp of exultation and stood staggering, and, as it seemed to me, in serious danger of either going backwards down the companion hatchway or forwards upon his victory. So soon as the second man had appeared, Montgomery had started forward. "Steady on there!" he cried in a tone of remonstrance. A couple of sailors appeared on the forecastle. A black-faced man, howling in a singular voice, rolled about under the feet of the dog. No one attempted to help him. The brutes did their best to worry him, butting their muzzles at him. There was a quick dance of their little gray-figured bodies over the clumsy, prostrate figure. The sailors forward shouted, as though it was admirable sport. Montgomery gave an angry exclamation and went striding down the deck, and I followed him. The black-faced man scrambled up and staggered forward, coloring and leaning over the bulwark by the main shrouds, where he remained, panting and glaring over his shoulder at the dogs. The red-haired man laughed a satisfied laugh. "Look here, Captain," said Montgomery, with his lisp a little accentuated, gripping the elbows of the red-haired man. "This won't do." I stood behind Montgomery. The captain came half round and regarded him with the dull and solemn eyes of a drunken man. "What won't do?" he said, and added, after looking sleepily into Montgomery's face for a minute, "Blasted Sarbones." With a sudden movement, he shook his arms free, and after 2 ineffectual attempts, stuck his freckled fists into his side pockets. "That man's a passenger," said Montgomery. "I'd advise you to keep your hands off him." "Go to hell," said the captain loudly. He suddenly turned and staggered towards the side. "Do what I like on my own ship," he said. I think Montgomery might have left him then, seeing the brute was drunk. But he only turned a shade paler and followed the captain to the bulwarks. "Look you here, Captain," he said. "That man of mine is not to be ill-treated. He has been hazed ever since he came aboard." For a minute, alcoholic feels kept the captain speechless. "Blasted Sarbones," was all he considered necessary. I could see that Montgomery had one of those slow, pertinacious tempers that will warm day after day to a white heat, never again cool to forgiveness. And I saw, too, that this quarrel had been some time growing. "The man's drunk," said I, perhaps officiously. "You'll do no good." Montgomery gave an ugly twist to his dropping lip. "He's always drunk. Do you think that excuses his assaulting his passengers?" "My ship," began the captain, waving his hand unsteadily towards the cages, "was a clean ship. Look at it now." It was certainly anything but clean. "Crew," continued the captain, "clean, respectable crew. You agreed to take the beasts. I wish I never set eyes on your infernal island. What the devil want beasts for on an island like that? And that man of yours, understood he was a man, he's a lunatic, and he had no business aft. Do you think the whole damn ship belongs to you? Your sailors began to haze the poor devil as soon as he came aboard. That's just what he is. He's a devil, an ugly devil. My men can't stand him. I can't stand him. None of us can't stand him. Nor you either." Montgomery turned away. "You'll leave that man alone anyhow," he said, nodding his head as he spoke. But the captain meant to quarrel now. He raised his voice. "If he comes this end of the ship again, I'll cut his insides out, I tell you. Cut out his blasted insides. Who are you to tell me what I'm to do? I tell you I'm captain of this ship, captain and owner. I'm the law here, I tell you, the law and the prophets. I bargained to take a man and his attendant to and from Africa and bring back some animals. I never bargained to carry a mad devil and a silly sawbones. Well, never mind what he called Montgomery." I saw the latter take a step forward and interposed. "He's drunk," said I. The captain began some abuse even fouler than the last. "Shut up," I said, turning on him sharply, for I had seen danger in Montgomery's white face. With that, I brought the downpour on myself. However, I was glad to avert what was uncommonly near a scuffle, even at the price of the captain's drunken ill will. I do not think I have ever heard quite so much vile language come in a continuous stream from any man's lips before, though I have frequented eccentric company enough. I found some of it hard to endure, so I am a mild-tempered man. But certainly, when I told the captain to shut up, I had forgotten that I was merely a bit of human flotsam, cut off from my resources, and with my fare unpaid. a mere casual dependent on the bounty or speculative enterprise of the ship. He reminded me of it with considerable vigor, but at any rate, I prevented the fight. End of Part 1. Part 2 of The Island of Dr. Moreau. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. At the Schooner's Rail. That night, land was sighted after sundown, and the schooner hove to. Montgomery intimated that was his destination. It was too far to see any details. It seemed to me there simply a low-lying patch of dim blue in the uncertain blue-gray sea. An almost vertical streak of smoke went up from it into the sky. The captain was not on deck when it was sighted. After he had vented his wrath on me, he had staggered below, and I understood he went to sleep on the floor of his own cabin. The mate practically assumed the command. He was the gaunt, taciturn individual we had seen at the wheel. Apparently, he was in an evil temper with Montgomery. He took not the slightest notice of either of us. We dined with him in a sulky silence, after a few ineffectual efforts on my part to talk. It struck me, too, that the man regarded my companion and his animals in a singularly unfriendly manner. I found Montgomery very reticent about his purpose with these creatures and about his destination. And though I was sensible of a growing curiosity as to both, I did not press him. We remained talking on the quarterdeck until the sky was thick with stars, except for an occasional sound in the yellow-lit forecastle and the movement of the animals now and then. The night was very still. The puma lay crouched together, watching us with shining eyes, a black heap in the corner of his cage. Montgomery produced some cigars. He talked to me of London in a tone of half-painful reminiscence, asking all kinds of questions about changes that had taken place. He spoke like a man who had loved his life there, and had been suddenly and irrevocably cut off from it. I gossiped as well as I could of this and that. All the time, the strangeness of him was shaping itself in my mind, and as I talked, I peered at his odd, pallid face in the dim light of the medical lantern behind me. Then I looked out at the darkened sea, where in the dimness his little island was hidden. This man, it seemed to me, had come out of immensity really to save my life. Tomorrow he would drop over the side and vanish again out of my existence. Even if it had been under commonplace circumstances, it would have made me a trifle thoughtful. But in the first place was the singularity of an educated man living on this unknown little island, coupled with the extraordinary nature of his life. I found myself repeating the captain's question. What did he want with the beasts? Why, too, had he pretended they were not his when I remarked on them at first? Then, again, in his personal attentions, there was a bizarre quality which had impressed me profoundly. These circumstances threw a haze of mystery around the man, and they laid hold of my imagination and hampered my thinking. Towards midnight, our talk of London died away, and we stood side by side, leaning over the bulwarks and staring dreamily over the silent, starlit sea, each pursuing his own thoughts. It was the atmosphere for sentiment, and I began upon my gratitude. If I may say it, I said after a time, you have saved my life. Chance, he answered. Just chance. I prefer to make my thanks to this accessible agent. Thank no one. You had the need and I had the knowledge, and I injected and fed you much as I might have collected a specimen. I was bored, wanted something different. If I'd been jaded that day, or had liked your face, well, it's a curious question where you would have been now. This damped my mood a little. At any rate, I began, it's a chance, I tell you, he interrupted, as everything is in a man's life. Only the asses won't see it. Why am I here now, an outcast from civilization, instead simply because 11 years ago I lost my head for 10 minutes on a foggy night. He stopped. Yes, said I. That's all. We relapsed into silence. Presently, he laughed. There's something in this starlight that loosens one's tongue. I'm an ass, and yet somehow I would like to tell you. Whatever you tell me, you may rely upon my keeping it to myself, if that's it. He was on the point of beginning, and then shook his head doubtfully. Don't, said I. It is all the same to me. After all, it is better to keep your secret. There's nothing gained but a little relief if I respect your confidence. If I don't, well, he grunted undecidedly. I felt I had him at a disadvantage, had caught him in the mood of indiscretion. And to tell the truth, I was not curious to learn what might have driven a young medical student out of London. I have an imagination. I shrugged my shoulders and turned away. Over the taffrail leaned a silent black figure, watching the stars. It was Montgomery's strange attendant, and looked over his shoulder quickly with my movement, then looked away again. It may seem a little thing to you, perhaps, but it came like a sudden blow to me. The only light near us was a lantern on the wheel. The creature's face was turned for one brief instant out of the dimness of the stern towards this illumination, and I saw that the eyes that glanced at me shone with a pale green light. I did not know then that a reddish luminosity, at least, is not uncommon in human eyes. The thing came to me as stark inhumanity. That black figure with his eyes of fire struck down to all my adult thoughts and feelings. For a moment, the forgotten horrors of childhood came back to my mind. Then the effect passed as it had come. An uncouth black figure of a man, a figure of no particular import, hung over the taffrail against the starlight, and I found Montgomery was speaking to me. I'm thinking of turning in, then, said he, if you've had enough of this. I answered him incongruously. We went below, and he wished me good night at the door of my cabin. That night I had some very unpleasant dreams. The waning moon rose late. Its light struck a glossy white beam across my cabin and made an ominous shape on the planking by my bunk. Then the staghounds woke and began howling and baying, so that I dreamt fitfully and scarcely slept until the approach of dawn. Chapter 5. The Man Who Had Nowhere to Go. In the early morning, it was the second morning after my recovery, and I believe the fourth after I was picked up, I awoke from an avenue of tumultuous dreams, dreams of guns and howling mobs, and became sensible of a hoarse shouting above me. I rubbed my eyes and lay listening to the noise, doubting for a little while of my whereabouts. Then came a sudden pattering of bare feet, the sound of heavy objects being thrown about, a violent creaking and a rattling of chains. I heard the swish of the water as the ship was suddenly brought round, and a foamy yellow-green wave flew across the little round window and left it streaming. I jumped into my clothes and went on deck. As I came up the ladder, I saw against the flushed sky, for the sun was just rising, the broad back and red hair of the captain, the puma spinning from a tackle rigged onto the bosom spanker boom. The poor brute seemed horribly scared and crouched in the bottom of his little cage. Overboard with him, called the captain. Overboard with him. We'll have a clean ship soon of the whole biting of them. He stood in my way, so that I had perforce to tap his shoulder to come on deck. He came round with a start and staggered back a few paces to stare at me. It needed no expert eye to tell that the man was still drunk. "Hullo," said he stupidly, and then, with a light coming into his eyes, "Why, it's Mr. Prendick," said I. "Prendick be damned," said he. "Shut up, that's your name, Mr. Shut Up." certainly did not expect his next move. He held out his hand in a gangway by which Montgomery stood talking to a massive gray-haired man with dirty blue flannels who had apparently just come aboard. "That way, Mr. Blasted Shopper! That way!" roared the captain. Montgomery and his companion turned as he spoke. "What do you mean?" I said. "That way, Mr. Blasted Shopper! That's what I mean! Overboard, Mr. Shopper, and shout! We're cleaning the ship out! Cleaning the whole blessed ship out! Overboard you go!" I stared at him, dumbfounded. Then it occurred to me that it was exactly the thing I wanted. The lost prospect of a journey as sole passenger with this quarrelsome sot was not what to mourn over. I turned towards Montgomery. "Can't have you," said Montgomery's companion concisely. "You can't have me," said I, aghast. He had the squarest and most resolute face I ever set eyes upon. "Look here," I began, turning to the captain. "Overboard," said the captain. "This ship ain't for beasts and cannibals and worse than beasts anymore. Overboard you go, Mr. Sharp. If they can't have it, you goes overboard. But anyhow, you go with your friends. I'm done with this pleasure island forevermore. Amen. I've had enough of it." "But Montgomery," I appealed. He distorted his lower lip and nodded his head hopelessly at the gray-haired man deciding to indicate his powerlessness to help me. "I'll see to you presently," said the captain. Then began a curious three-cornered altercation. Alternately, I appealed to one and another of the three men, first to the gray-haired man to let me land, and then to the drunken captain to keep me aboard. I even bawled entreaties to the sailors. Montgomery said never a word, only shook his head. "You're going overboard, I tell you," was the captain's refrain. "Law be damned, I'm king here." At last, I must confess, my voice suddenly broke in the middle of a vigorous threat. I felt a gust of hysterical petulance and went aft and stared dismally at nothing. Meanwhile, the sailors progressed rapidly with the task of unshipping the packages and caged animals. A large launch with two standing lugs lay under the lee of the schooner, and into this the strange assortment of goods were swung. I did not then see the hands from the island that were receiving the packages, for the hull of the launch was hidden from me by the side of the schooner. Neither Montgomery nor his companion took the slightest notice of me, but busied themselves in assisting and directing the 4 or 5 sailors who were unloading the goods. The captain went forward interfering rather than assisting. I was alternately despairful and desperate. Once or twice, as I stood waiting there for things to accomplish themselves, I could not resist an impulse to laugh at my miserable pondering. I felt all the wretcheder for the lack of a breakfast. Hunger and a lack of blood corpuscles take all the manhood from a man. I perceived pretty clearly that I had not the stamina either to resist what the captain chose to do to expel me, or to force myself upon Montgomery and his companion. So I waited passively upon fate, and the work of transferring Montgomery's possessions to the launch went on, as if I did not exist. Presently, that work was finished, and then came a struggle. I was hauled, resisting weakly enough to the gangway. Even then, I noticed the oddness of the brown faces of the men who were with Montgomery in the launch. But the launch was now fully laden, and was shoved off hastily. A broadening gap of green water appeared under me, and I pushed back with all my strength to avoid falling headlong. The hands in the launch shouted derisively, and I heard Montgomery curse at them. And then the captain, the mates, and one of the seamen helping him ran me aft towards the stern. The dinghy of the Lady Vane had been towing behind. It was half full of water, had no oars, and was quite unvictualled. I refused to go aboard her, and flung myself full length on the deck. In the end, they swung me into her by a rope, for they had no stern ladder, and then they cut me adrift. I drifted slowly from the schooner. In a kind of stupor, I watched all hands take to the rigging, and slowly but surely she came round to the wind. The sails fluttered, and then bellied out as the wind came into them. I stared at her weather-beaten side, heeling steeply towards me, and then she passed out of my range of view. I did not turn my head to follow her. At first, I could scarcely believe what had happened. I crouched in the bottom of the dinghy, stunned and staring blankly at the vacant, oily sea. Then I realized that I was in that little hell of mine again, now half swamped. And looking back over the gunwale, I saw the schooner standing away from me, with the red-haired captain mocking at me over the taffrail, and turning towards the island, saw the launch growing smaller as she approached the beach. Abruptly, the cruelty of this desertion became clear to me. I had no means of reaching the land unless I should chance to drift there. I was still weak, you must remember, from my exposure in the boat. I was empty and very faint, or I should have had more heart. But as it was, I suddenly began to sob and weep, as I had never done since I was a little child. The tears ran down my face. In a passion of despair, I struck with my fists at the water in the bottom of the boat and kicked savagely at the gunwale. I prayed aloud for God to let me die.
You win.
Chapter 6. The Evil-Looking Boatman. But the islanders, seeing that I was really adrift, took pity on me. I drifted very slowly to the eastward, approaching the island slantingly, and presently I saw, with hysterical relief, the launch come round and return towards me. She was heavily laden, and I could make out, as she drew nearer, Montgomery's white-haired, broad-shouldered companion, sitting cramped up with the dogs and several packing cases in the stern sheets. This individual stared fixedly at me, without moving or speaking. The black-faced cripple was glaring at me as fixedly in the bows near the puma. There were 3 other men besides, 3 strange, brutish-looking fellows, at whom the staghounds were snarling savagely. Montgomery, who was steering, brought the boat by me, and rising, caught and fastened my painter to the tiller to tow me, for there was no room aboard. I had recovered from my hysterical phase by this time, and answered his hail as he approached bravely enough. I told him the dinghy was nearly swamped, and he reached me a piggin. I was jerked back as the rope tightened between the boats. For some time I was busy bailing. It was not until I had got the water under, for the water in the dinghy had been shipped, the boat was perfectly sound, that I had leisure to look at the people in the launch again. The white-haired man, I found, was still regarding me steadfastly, but with an expression, as I now fancied, of some perplexity. When my eyes met his, he looked down at the staghound that sat between his knees. He was a powerfully built man, as I have said, with a fine forehead and rather heavy features, but his eyes had that odd drooping of the skin above the lids which often comes with advancing years, and the fall of his heavy mouth at the corners gave him an expression of pugnacious resolution. He talked to Montgomery in a tone too low for me to hear. From him my eyes traveled to his 3 men, and a strange crew they were. I saw only their faces, yet there was something in their faces, I knew not what, that gave me a queer spasm of disgust. I looked steadily at them, and the impression did not pass, though I failed to see what had occasioned it. They seemed to me then to be brown men, but their limbs were oddly swathed in some thin, dirty white stuff down even to the fingers and feet. I have never seen men so wrapped up before, and women so only in the East. They wore turbans, too, and thereunder peered out their elfin faces at me, faces with protruding lower jaws and bright eyes. They had lank black hair, almost like horsehair, and seemed, as they sat, to exceed in stature any race of men I have seen. The white-haired man, who I knew was a good 6 feet in height, sat a head below any one of the three. I found afterwards that really none were taller than myself, but their bodies were abnormally long, and the thigh part of the leg short and curiously twisted. At any rate, they were an amazingly ugly gang, and over the heads of them, under the forward lug, peered the black face of the man whose eyes were luminous in the dark. As I stared at them, they met my gaze, and then first one and then another turned away from my direct stare and looked at me in an odd, furtive manner. It occurred to me that I was perhaps annoying them, and I turned my attention to the island we were approaching. It was low and covered with thick vegetation, chiefly a kind of palm that was new to me. From one point, a thin white thread of vapor rose slantingly to an immense height, and then flayed out like a down feather. We were now within the embrace of a broad bay, flanked on either hand by a low promontory. The beach was of dull gray sand, and sloped steeply up to a ridge, perhaps 60 or 70 feet above the sea level, and irregularly set with trees and undergrowth. Halfway up was a square enclosure of some grayish stone, which I found subsequently was built partly of coral and partly of pumiceous lava. Two thatched roofs peeped from within this enclosure. A man stood awaiting us at the water's edge. I fancied, while we were still far off, that I saw some other and very grotesque-looking creatures scuttle into the bushes upon the slope. But I saw nothing of these as we drew nearer. This man was of a moderate size, and with a black, negroid face. He had a large, almost lipless mouth, extraordinary lank arms, long, thin feet, and bow legs, and stood with his heavy face thrust forward, staring at us. He was dressed like Montgomery and his white-haired companion, in jacket and trousers of blue serge. As we came still nearer, this individual began to run to and fro on the beach, making the most grotesque movements. At a word of command from Montgomery, the four men in the launch sprang up, and with singularly awkward gestures struck the lugs. Montgomery steered us round and into a narrow little dock excavated in the beach. Then the man on the beach hastened towards us. This dock, as I call it, was really a mere ditch, just long enough at this phase of the tide to take the longboat. I heard the bows ground in the sand, staved the dinghy off the rudder of the big boat with my piggin, and freeing the painter, landed. The three muffled men, with the clumsiest movements, scrambled out upon the sand, and forthwith set to landing the cargo, assisted by the man on the beach. I was struck especially by the curious movements of the legs of the three swathed and bandaged boatmen. Not stiff they were, but distorted in some odd way, almost as if they were jointed in the wrong place. The dogs were still snarling, and strayed at their chains after these men as the white-haired man landed with them. The three big fellows spoke to one another in odd guttural tones, and the man who had waited for us on the beach began chattering to them excitedly, a foreign language, as I fancied, as they laid hands on some bales piled near the stern. Somewhere I had heard such a voice before, and I could not think where. The white-haired man stood, holding in a tumult of 6 dogs, and bawling orders over their din. Montgomery, having unshipped the rudder, landed likewise, and all set to work at unloading. I was too faint, what with my long fast and the sun beating down on my bare head, to offer any assistance. Presently, the white-haired man seemed to recollect my presence, and came up to me. "You look," said he, "as though you had scarcely breakfasted." His little eyes were a brilliant black under his heavy brows. "I must apologize for that. Now you are our guest, we must make you comfortable, though you are uninvited, you know." He looked keenly into my face. "Montgomery says you are an educated man, Mr. Prendick. Says you know something of science. May I ask what that signifies?" I told him I had spent some years at the Royal College of Science, and had done some researches in biology under Huxley. He raised his eyebrows slightly at that. "That alters the case a little, Mr. Prendick," he said, with a trifle more respect in his manner. "As it happens, we are biologists here. This is a biological station of a sort." His eye rested on the men in white who were busily hauling the puma on rollers towards the walled yard. "I and Montgomery, at least," he added. "Then, when you will be able to get away, I can't say. We're off the track to anywhere. We see a ship once in a 12-month or so." He left me abruptly and went up the beach past this group, and I think entered the enclosure. The other two men were with Montgomery, erecting a pile of smaller packages on a low-wheeled truck. The llama was still on the launch with the rabbit hutches. The staghounds were still lashed to the thwarts. The pile of things completed, all three men laid hold of the truck and began shoving the ton weight or so upon it after the puma. Presently, Montgomery left them, and coming back to me, held out his hand. "I'm glad," said he, "for my own part. That captain was a silly ass. He'd have made things lively for you." "It was you," said I, "that saved me again." "That depends. You'll find this island an infernally rum place, I promise you. I'd watch my goings carefully, if I were you. He hesitated, and seemed to alter his mind about what was on his list. "I wish you'd help me with these rabbits," he said. His procedure with the rabbits was singular. I waded in with him, and helped him lug one of the hutches ashore. No sooner was that done than he opened the door of it, and tilting the thing on one end, turned its living contents out on the ground. They fell in a struggling heap, one on top of the other. He clapped his hands, and forthwith they went off with that hopping run of theirs, 15 or 20 of them, I should think, up the beach. "Increase and multiply, my friends," said Montgomery. "Replenish the island. Hitherto we've had a certain lack of meat here." As I watched them disappearing, the white-haired man returned with a brandy flask and some biscuits. "Something to go on with, Prendick," said he, in a far more familiar tone than before. I made no ado, but set to work on the biscuits at once, while the white-haired man helped Montgomery to release about a score more of the rabbits. 3 big hutches, however, went up to the house with the puma. The brandy I did not touch, for I had been an abstainer from my birth. End of Part 2. Part 3 of The Island of Dr. Moreau. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. The Locked Door. The reader will perhaps understand that at first everything was so strange about me, and my position was the outcome of such unexpected adventures, that I had no discernment of the relative strangeness of this or that thing. I followed the llama up the beach, and was overtaken by Montgomery, who asked me not to enter the stone enclosure. I noticed then that the puma in its cage and a pile of packages had been placed outside the entrance to this quadrangle. I turned and saw that the launch had now been unloaded, run out again, and was being beached, and the white-haired man was walking towards us. He addressed Montgomery. "And now comes the problem of this uninvited guest. What are we to do with him?" "He knows something of science," said Montgomery. "I'm itching to get to work again with this new stuff," said the white-haired man, nodding towards the enclosure. His eyes grew brighter. "I dare say you are," said Montgomery, in anything but a cordial tone. "We can't send him over there, and we can't spare the time to build him a new shanty, and we certainly can't take him into our confidence just yet." "I'm in your hands," said I. I had no idea of what he meant by over there. "I've been thinking of the same thing," Montgomery answered. "There's my room with the outer door." "That's it," said the elder man, promptly, looking at Montgomery. and all three of us went toward the enclosure. I'm sorry to make a mystery, Mr. Prendick, but you'll remember you're uninvited. Our little establishment here contains a secret or so. It's a kind of Bluebeard's chamber, in fact. Nothing very dreadful, really, to a sane man. But just now, as we don't know you. Decidedly, said I should be a fool to take any offense at any want of confidence. He twisted his heavy mouth into a faint smile. He was one of those saturnine people who smile with the corners of the mouth down, and bowed his acknowledgment of my complaisance. The main entrance to the enclosure was passed. It was a heavy wooden gate, framed in iron and locked, with the cargo of a launch piled outside it, and at the corner we came to a small doorway I had not previously observed. The white-haired man produced a bundle of keys from the pocket of his greasy blue jacket, opened this door, and entered. His keys, and the elaborate locking up of the place, even while it was still under his eye, struck me as peculiar. I followed him and found myself in a small apartment, plainly but not uncomfortably furnished, and with its inner door, which was slightly ajar, opening into a paved courtyard. This inner door Montgomery at once closed. A hammock was slung across the darker corner of the room, and a small unglazed window, defended by an iron bar, looked out towards the sea. This, the white-haired man told me, was to be my apartment, and the inner door, which, for fear of accidents, he said, he would lock on the other side, was my limit inward. He called my attention to a convenient deck chair before the window, and to an array of old books. Chiefly, I found surgical works and editions of the Latin and Greek classics, languages I cannot read with any comfort, on a shelf near the hammock. He left the room by the outer door, as if to avoid opening the inner one again. We usually have our meals in here, said Montgomery, and then, as if in doubt, went out after the other. Moreau, I heard him call, and for the moment I do not think I noticed. Then, as I handled the books on the shelf, it came up in consciousness. Where had I heard the name of Moreau before? I sat down before the window, took out the biscuits that still remained to me, and ate them with an excellent appetite. Moreau. Through the window, I saw one of those unaccountable men in white, lugging a packing case along the beach. Presently, the window frame hit him. Then I heard a key inserted and turned in the lock behind me. After a little while, I heard through the locked door the noise of the staghounds that had now been brought up from the beat. They were not barking, but sniffing and growling in a curious fashion. I could hear the rapid patter of their feet, and Montgomery's voice soothing them. I was very much impressed by the elaborate secrecy of these two men regarding the contents of the place, and for some time I was thinking of that and of the unaccountable familiarity of the name of Moreau. But so odd is the human memory that I could not then recall that well-known name in its proper connection. From that, my thoughts went to the indefinable queerness of the deformed man on the beach. I never saw such a gait, such odd motions as he pulled at the box. I recalled that none of these men had spoken to me, though most of them I had found looking at me at one time or another in a peculiarly furtive manner, quite unlike the frank stare of your unsophisticated savage. Indeed, they had all seemed remarkably taciturn, and when they did speak, endowed with very uncanny voices. What was wrong with them? Then I recalled the eyes of Montgomery's ungainly attendant. Just as I was thinking of him, he came in. He was now dressed in white, and carried a little tray with some coffee and boiled vegetables thereon. I could hardly repress a shuddering recoil as he came, bending amiably, and placed the tray before me on the table. Then astonishment paralyzed me. Under his stringy black locks, I saw his ear. It jumped upon me suddenly close to my face. The man had pointed ears, covered with a fine brown fur. "Your breakfast, sir?" he said. I stared at his face without attempting to answer him. He turned and went towards the door, regarding me oddly over his shoulder. I followed him out with my eyes, and as I did so, by some odd trick of unconscious cerebration, there came surging into my head the phrase, "The Moreau Hollows," was it? The Moreau... it set my memory back 10 years. The Moreau Horrors. The phrase drifted loose in my mind for a moment, and then I saw it in red lettering on a little buff-colored pamphlet, to read which made one shiver and creep. Then I remembered distinctly all about it. That long-forgotten pamphlet came back with startling vividness to my mind. I had been a mere lad then, and Moreau was, I suppose, about 50, a prominent and masterful physiologist, well known in scientific circles for his extraordinary imagination and his brutal directness in discussion. Was this the same Moreau? He had published some very astonishing facts in connection with the transfusion of blood, and in addition was known to be doing valuable work on morbid growths. Then, suddenly, his career was closed. He had to leave England. A journalist obtained access to his laboratory in the capacity of laboratory assistant, with the deliberate intention of making sensational exposure. And by the help of a shocking accident, if it was an accident, his gruesome pamphlet became notorious. On the day of its publication, a wretched dog, flayed and otherwise mutilated, escaped from Moreau's house. It was in the silly season, and a prominent editor, a cousin of the temporary laboratory assistant, appealed to the conscience of the nation. It was not the first time that conscience has turned against the methods of research. The doctor was simply howled out of the country. It may be that he deserved to be, but I still think that the tepid support of his fellow investigators and his desertion by the great body of scientific workers was a shameful thing. Yet some of his experiments, by the journalist's accounts, were wantonly cruel. He might, perhaps, have purchased his social peace by abandoning his investigations, but he apparently preferred the latter, as most men would who have once fallen under the overmastering spell of research. He was unmarried, and had indeed nothing but his own interest to consider. I felt convinced that this must be the same man. Everything pointed to it. It dawned upon me to what end the puma and the other animals, which had now been brought with other luggage into the enclosure behind the house, were destined. And a curious faint odor, the holitis of something familiar, an odor that had been in the background of my consciousness hitherto, suddenly came forward into the forefront of my thoughts. It was the antiseptic odor of the dissecting room. I heard the puma growling through the wall, and one of the dogs yelped, though it had been struck. Yet surely, and especially to another scientific man, there was nothing so horrible in vivisection as to account for this secrecy. And by some odd beat in my thoughts, the pointed ears and luminous eyes of the company's attendant came back again before me with the sharpest definition. I stared before me out at the green sea, frothing under a freshening breeze, and let these and other strange memories of the last few days chase one another through my mind. What could it all mean? A locked enclosure on a lonely island, a notorious vivisector, and these crippled and distorted men. Chapter 8. The Crying of the Puma. Montgomery interrupted my candle of mystification and suspicion about 1 o'clock, and his grotesque attendant followed him with a tray bearing bread, some herbs and other victuals, a flask of whiskey, a jar of water, and 3 glasses and knives. I glanced askance at this strange creature, and found him watching me with his clear, restless eyes. Montgomery said that he would lunch with me, but that Moreau was too preoccupied with some work to come. "Moreau," said I know that name." "The devil you do," said he. "What an ass I must have mentioned it to you. I might have wrong. Anyhow, it will give you an inkling of our mysteries. Whiskey?" "No, thanks, I'm had some. I wish I did. But it's no use looking at more after the speed is summer. It was that infernal stuff which led to my coming here, that on a foggy night. I thought myself in luck at the time, the moreau offered to get me off. It's here. Montgomery, said I, suddenly, as the outer door closed, why has your man pointed ears? Damn, he said, after his first mouthful of food. He stared at me for a moment, and then repeated, pointed ears? Who points to me, said I, as promptly as possible, to the captured my breath. And a fine catch for her, he had given me. He helped himself to whiskey and water with great deliberation. I was under the impression that his hair covered his ears. I saw them as he stooped by me to put that coffee he sent to me on the table, and his eyes shine in the dark. By this time, Montgomery had recovered from the surprise of my question. I always thought, he said deliberately, with a certain accentuation of his flavoring of this, that there was something the matter with his ears from the way he covered them. What were they like? I was persuaded from his manner that this ignorance was a pretext. Still, I could hardly tell the man that I thought him a liar. Pointed, I said, rather small and furry, distinctly furry. But the old man is one of the strangest breeds I ever set eyes on. A sharp, hoarse cry of animal pain came from the enclosure behind me. Its depth and volume testified to the female. I saw Montgomery embrace. Yes, he said. Where did you pick up the creature? San Francisco. He's an ugly brute, I admit. Half-witted, you know. Can't remember where he came from. But I'm used to him, you know. We both are. How does he strike you? He's unnatural, I said. There's something about him. Don't think me fanciful, but it gives me a nasty little sensation. A tightening of my muscles when he comes near me. It's a touch of the diabolical, in fact. Montgomery had stopped eating while I told him this. Rum, he said. I can't see it. He resumed his meal. I had no idea of it, he said, and masticated. The crew of the schooner must have felt it the same. Made a dead set, the poor devil. You saw the captain. Suddenly, the puma howled again, this time more painfully. Montgomery swore under his breath. I had half a mind to attack him about the man on the beach. Then, the poor brute within gave vent to a series of short and sharp cries. Your men on the beach, said I. What race are they? Excellent fellows, aren't they? Said he, absent-mindedly, knitting his brows as the animal yelled out sharply. I said no more. There was another outcry worse than the former. He looked at me with his dull gray eyes and then took some more whiskey. He tried to draw me into a discussion about alcohol, which I seem to have saved my life with. He seemed anxious to lay stress on the fact that I owed my life to him. I answered him with respect. Presently, our meal came to an end. The misshapen monster with the pointed ears cleared the remains away, and Montgomery left me alone in the room again. All the time, he had been in a state of ill-conceived irritation at the noise of the vivisected puma. He had spoken of his hard point of nerve, and left me to the obvious application. I found myself that the cries were singularly irritating, and they grew in depth and intensity as the afternoon wore on. They were painful at first, but their constant resurgence at last altogether upset my balance. I flung aside a bit of chorus I had read, and began to clench my fists, to bite my lips, and to pace the room. Presently, I got the sound in my ears with my fingers. The emotional appeal of those yells grew upon me suddenly, grew at last to such an exquisite expression of suffering that I could stand it in that confined room no longer. I stepped out of the door into the slumberous heat of the late afternoon. Walking past the main entrance, once again, I noticed, turned the corner of the wall. The crying sounded even louder out of doors. It was as if all the pain in the world had found a voice. Yet, had I known such pain was in the next room, and had it been done, I believe, I had thought since, I I could have stood it well enough. It is when suffering finds a voice, sets our nerves quivering, that this pity comes troubling us. But in spite of the brilliant sunlight and the green fans of the trees waving in the soothing sea breeze, the world was a confusion, blurred with drifting black and red phantasms, until I was out of earshot of the house in the shattered wall. Chapter 9. The Thing in the Forest. I strode through the undergrowth that clothed the ridge behind the house, scarcely heeding whither I went. Passed on through the shadow of a thick cluster of straight-stemmed trees beyond it, and so, presently, found myself some way on the other side of the ridge, and descending towards a streamlet that ran through a narrow valley. I paused and listened. The distance I had come, or the intervening masses of thicket, deafened any sound that might be coming from the enclosure. The air was still. Then, with a rustle, a rabbit emerged, and went scampering up the slope before me. I hesitated, and sat down at the edge of the shade. The place was a pleasant one. The rivulet was hidden by the luxuriant vegetation of the banks, save at one point, where I caught a triangular patch of its glittering water. On the farther side, I saw through a bluish haze a tangle of trees and creepers, and above these, again, a luminous blue of the sky. Here and there, a splash of white or crimson marked the blooming of some trailing epiphyte. I let my eyes wander over this scene for a while, and then began to turn over in my mind again the strange peculiarities of Montgomery's man. But it was too hot to think elaborately, and presently I fell into a tranquil state, midway between dozing and waking. From this I was aroused, after I know not how long, by a rustling amidst the greenery on the other side of the stream. For a moment I had seen nothing but the waving summits of the ferns and reeds. Then suddenly, upon the bank of the stream appeared something. At first I could not distinguish what it was. It bowed its round head to the water and began to drink. Then I saw it was a man going on all fours like a beast. He was clothed in bluish cloth and was of a copper-colored hue with black hair. It seemed that grotesque ugliness was an invariable character of these islanders. I could hear the suck of the water at his lips as he drank. I leaned forward to see him better, and a piece of lava, detached by my hand, went pattering down the slope. He looked up guiltily, and his eyes met mine. Forthwith he scrambled to his feet, and stood wiping his clumsy hand across his body and regarding me. His legs were scarcely half the length of his body, so, staring one another out of countenance, we remained for perhaps the space of a minute. Then, stopping to look back once or twice, he slunk off among the bushes to the right of me, and I heard the swish of the frogs grow faint in the distance and die away. Long after he had disappeared, I remained sitting up, staring in the direction of his retreat. My drowsy tranquility had gone. I was startled by a noise behind me, and turning suddenly, saw the flapping white tail of a rabbit vanishing up the slope. I jumped to my feet. The apparition of this grotesque, half-bestial character had suddenly populated the stillness of the afternoon for me. I looked around me rather nervously, and regretted that I was not armed. Then I thought that the man I had just seen had been clothed in bluish cloth, and not been naked as a savage would have been, and I tried to persuade myself from that fact that he was, after all, probably a peaceful character, that the dull ferocity of his countenance belied him. Yet I was greatly disturbed at the apparition. I walked to the left along the slope, turning my head about and peering this way and that among the straight stems of the trees. Why should a man go on all fours and drink with his lips? Presently, I heard an animal wailing again, and taking it to be a puma, I turned about and walked in the direction diametrically opposite to the sound. This led me down to the stream, across which I stepped and pushed my way up through the undergrowth beyond. I was startled by a great patch of vivid scarlet on the ground, and going up to it, found it to be a peculiar fungus, fresh and corrugated like a foliaceous blanket, but delicating into slime at the top. And then, in the shadow of some luxuriant ferns, I came upon an unpleasant thing. The dead body of a rabbit, covered with shining flies, but still warm and with the head torn off. I stopped aghast at the sight of the scattered blood. Here at least was one visitor to the island it disposed of. There were no traces of other violence about it. It looked as though it had been suddenly snatched up and killed. And as I stared at the little furry body, came the difficulty of how the thing had been done. The vague dread that had been in my mind since I had seen the inhuman face of the man at the screen grew distincter as I stood there. I began to realize the hardihood of my expedition among these unknown people. The figures about me became altered to my imagination. Every shadow became something more than a shadow, became an ambush. Every muscle became a threat. Invisible things seemed watching me. I resolved to go back to the enclosure on the beach. I suddenly turned away and thrust myself violently, perhaps even frantically, through the bushes, anxious to get a clear space about me again. I stopped just in time to prevent myself lurching upon an open space. It was a kind of glade in the forest, made by a fall. Seedlings were already starting up to struggle for the vacant space, and beyond, the dense growth of stems and twining vines and splashes of fungus and flowers closed in again. Before me, squatting together upon the fungoid ruins of a huge fallen tree, and still unaware of my approach, were three grotesque human figures. One was evidently a female, the other two were men. They were naked, save for swathings of scarlet cloth about the middle, and their skins were of a dull pinkish black color, such as I had seen in no savages before. They had fat, heavy, chinless faces, retreating foreheads, and a scant, bristly hair upon their heads. I never saw such bestial-looking creatures. They were talking, or at least one of the men was talking to the other two, and all three had been too closely interested to heed the rustling of my approach. They swayed their heads and shoulders from side to side. The speaker's words came thick and sloppy, and though I could hear him distinctly, I could not distinguish what he said. He seemed to me to be reciting some complicated gibberish. Presently, his articulation became surer, and spreading his hands, he rose to his feet. At that, the others began to gibber in unison, also rising to their feet, spreading their hands and swaying their bodies in rhythm with their chant. I noticed then the abnormal shortness of their legs and their lank, clumsy feet. All three began slowly to circle round, raising and stabbing their feet and waving their arms. A kind of tune cracked into their rhythmic recitation, and the refrain, Alula or Balula, sounded like. Their eyes began to sparkle, and their ugly faces to brighten with an expression of strange pleasure. Saliva dripped from their lipless mouths. Suddenly, as I watched their grotesque and unaccountable gestures, I perceived clearly for the first time what it was that had offended me, what had given me the two inconsistent and conflicting impressions of utter strangeness and yet of the strangest familiarity. The three creatures engaged in this mysterious rite were human in shape, and yet human beings with the strangest air about them of some familiar animal. Each of these creatures, despite its human form, its rag of clothing, and the rough humanity of its bodily form, had woven into its movements, into the expression of its countenance, into its whole presence, some now irresistible suggestion of a hog, a swinish taint, the unmistakable mark of the beast. I stood overcome by this amazing realization, and then the most horrible questions came rushing into my mind. They began leaping in the air, first one and then the other, whooping and grunting. Then one slipped, and for a moment was on all fours, to recover indeed forthwith. But that transitory gleam of the true animalism of these monsters was enough. I turned as noiselessly as possible, and became every now and then rigid with the fear of being discovered, as a branch cried for a leaf rustle. I pushed back into the bushes. It was long before I grew bolder and dared to move freely. My only idea for the moment was to get away from those foul beings, I scarcely noticed that I had emerged upon a faint pathway amidst the trees. Then, suddenly traversing a little glade, I saw with an unpleasant start 2 clumsy legs among the trees, walking with noiseless footsteps parallel with my course, perhaps 30 yards away from me. The head and upper part of the body were hidden by a tangle of creepers. I stopped abruptly, hoping the creature did not see me. The feet stopped as I did. So nervous was I that I controlled an impulse to headlong flight with the utmost difficulty. Then, looking hard, I distinguished through the interlacing network the head and the body of the brute I had seen drinking. He moved his head. There was an emerald flash in his eyes as he glanced at me from the shadow of the trees, a half-luminous